Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Leadership Enigma. I'm Adam Pacifico, and welcome. And as you can see, we look and feel slightly different. And why is that? Why? Because we're now proudly powered by Transform Performance International. And I can't forget as well, the wonderful Launchpod Studios. And Transform Performance International, who are they? Well, they were my co-authors, hence some books on the desk, The Leader's Secret Code and The Salesperson's Secret Code. And there's even a suggestion we're going to do another book at some point. But that's a story for another time. But back to this particular episode, I'm looking forward to this because it's all about culture and just how much of an advantage is culture. So come back to me just after this, where we'll talk to the wonderful Daniel Strode, who is the author of The Culture Advantage, and we together will explore just why it's so important. So hi, it's a warm welcome to Dan Strode. Dan, how are you, my friend?
Really well, thanks, Adam. Good to speak to you again.
It is good to see you. Now, obviously, looking forward to inviting you, having you as a guest on the show, because you are indeed the author of The Culture Advantage. In fact, this is about you and your book. So you know what? I'll put these books down. Let's highlight your book, shall we? And the fact that you're also the Group Director, Culture and Strategy at Santander. That's a name that everybody will know for sure. But just tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to focus on this, The Culture Advantage, Dan.
Absolutely. So I'm probably not a unique, but a very curious blend of practitioner, culture practitioner in the bank, teacher as well at universities and different places around the world, and now a writer, as you say, a writer of The Culture Advantage. So a unique viewpoint I have on the topic of corporate culture. And it's interesting because I know the introduction says success leaves clues, and actually that's how my book starts and where its origin comes from. We're in the bad news. We're living, all of us, in the fourth industrial revolution. So I'm seeing companies around the world having customers complaining day in, day out, holding them to really high standards, jumping from one to another, becoming more digital, and so on and so forth. And that's putting a lot of strain upon companies around the world. And what I noticed was the best performing companies are doing certain things in the same way as one another. And actually, they're doing certain cultural things the same way. So high performing organizations, I observed, are having these systematic, similar patterns day in, day out. And that was really the genesis of the book.
And the reason that we connected. So I love the fact that we are going to focus on success leaving clues. But let me talk to you a little bit about, because I know that you spoke about the fourth industrial revolution, and I'm intrigued because we're in it, aren't we? And I remember talking to Jonathan Reichenthal, who is coming back on the show, actually, which I'm delighted about. And I asked Jonathan about the fourth industrial revolution. I remember he said to me, Adam, it is change at the speed of thought. Change at the speed of thought. So Dan, what is your view of us being in the fourth industrial revolution at the moment and how that's important to, again, culture?
Yeah, is really good, and I'm glad he's coming back on because we're going to learn a lot from him.
We are.
I guess for me, the fourth industrial revolution is, as you say, the pace of change has never been so fast and never will it be so slow as it is today. And that's because we used to go through change one thing at a time. So the internet came along and it was only the internet. But now artificial intelligence, 5G, robotics, Internet of Things and sensors, all of these exponential changes are happening at the same time, which means the pace of change is so fast. And if you don't keep up with that change, you're doomed to failure. There's no ifs, buts and maybes. And the interesting statistic that I love is when you look at the S&P 500, so this is America's top 500 companies, the average lifespan of a company in that index is now less than 20 years. And by the way, in the 1960s, it was much higher. It was more than 60 years. So actually, companies used to outlive humans, and now it's the other way around. And if you extrapolate that data 5 years in the future, by 2027, 75% of the S&P 500 will no longer be in that index. So if you take 10 companies on the top of your head, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, so on and so forth, can you imagine 75% of them not being here in 5 years' time? It's not necessarily going to happen to the ones I've listed, but it's going to happen to 75% of that index. And that's scary.
Well, Dan, it is scary because if you think about it, what's going to happen to all of those people who are readily and happily employed by those organisations? In fact, there's something going on at the moment, isn't there, where a lot of tech employees are now being let go, especially over in the East. So we've got huge numbers now of tech personnel looking for new jobs. So that is quite worrying if you think about the statistics or numbers that you just gave, that a lot of these people in employment now will no longer be in employment if there's such a short lifespan on some of these big monolithic companies.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I suppose, and I really do believe this, new companies will spring up and new companies will surprise us, especially in the fields of artificial intelligence and so on. So the people that are being laid off today probably find employment in another company, in another form of work. But it's definitely going to be difficult and interesting times, I would say, as people navigate through that change, and also for the companies themselves as they navigate from being a giant of industry to a much smaller player and vice versa. What you do need is a strong, consistent, common culture to help you go through that.
Well, we're going to come on to that, aren't we? And maybe as you talk about the new companies that will take over the companies that go out of operation, etc. Do they go bust? I don't know. But maybe that's Phoenix from the ashes. So talk to me about generally now just some of the cultural patterns or behavioural patterns that you've studied that are important for all of us at the moment, especially as we talk about having to live and lead in this delta of incredible and speedy change.
Yeah, one of the most interesting ones is being able to rethink your business model.
Okay.
And this is something that's, I start the book with, and I think is very, very important because, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was that evolution happens and there's a natural selection. Well, the same happens with companies. And if you look at, one of the greatest corporate failures, perhaps in recent times, which was Kodak, that was an interesting one from a business perspective because they invented the first digital camera, but they didn't have the mindset of changing their business and their business model in order to adopt it. And you look at Lego, for example, who, started in the 1930s as a wooden toy manufacturer, and throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, did wonderful, wonderful business performance, all the way up until the late 1990s, where they started to drop off and nearly went bankrupt in the early 2000s.
I remember.
And the question was, why did that happen to them? And it was because they actually started outsourcing their manufacturing. They stopped listening to their customers, taking feedback, and they changed their culture. Their culture became counting the pennies rather than serving the customer and giving high quality products. So they brought in a new CEO in the early 2000s to help them turn around the company.
Yep.
And they did that. And they did that by focusing on the culture. They said, okay, customer at the heart of what we do. And, you see it today. They have Lego Ideas, a website where customers can put their ideas and make Lego products come to life. They do focus groups with children. And by the way, if you can do a focus group with a child, you can do it with an adult.
True.
So, they really put the customer at the center and they rethought their business model. So they said, we're no longer just in the toy block market. Actually, if people don't buy Lego, what do they buy? And they found out that they buy a PlayStation or an iPad. And they said, well, actually, we're in an entertainment business here. And now, of course, the Lego Movies franchise, the sneaker partnerships that they have, they've really changed their business model and way of operating. And that's been a fantastic, fantastic Phoenix from the ashes story.
And I'm glad you've mentioned Lego, and anyone listening to this episode, do go and check out the Lego story, because Dan, it is fascinating, isn't it? There's a real ethnography piece here as well, or a sense-making piece, because I think Lego challenged themselves and asked better questions, didn't they? Rather than, what kind of toy should we create? Is it pink blocks for girls and blue blocks for boys, and as simplistic as that? Actually, they challenged themselves with how do kids play. They really studied that, didn't they? And I think then they understood where their value proposition was. And as you said, the rest is history. But it's a fascinating case study.
Absolutely. Really, really fantastic, fascinating case study. And then when you contrast it against the corporate failures and the ones that didn't rise from the ashes, you can start to learn, okay, what are the principles here at play?
Now, when you talked about Kodak earlier, Dan, you talked about Kodak, and obviously that disappeared off the face of the earth, and anyone old enough will remember it. And I remember it fondly. Everything was always about, Kodak, a Kodak picture, a Kodak camera. And with that in mind, was that about culture, or did they just make really bad decisions in relation to not keeping up, and they became the disrupted and not the disruptor?
Yeah, I think they made bad cultural decisions because as I say, they did have the first digital camera. They just didn't have the mindset and agility to disrupt their own business model.
Right.
They didn't want to do that. They were very similar to Nokia as well, who, of course, went down a similar path. They thought that they could outspend their rivals. They fell into this trap of, bias, where they thought that they were geniuses and their success that they'd done would keep them going in the future. And they stopped sensing the market and looking externally at what was happening. And I think culturally, you can build that into your company. You can start to say, okay, as a leadership group, how much customer feedback do we get? How much market checking do we do? Do we hire consultancy companies to give us insights about what's happening? What are we looking at the trends? How much do we spend thinking about the future rather than the business of today?
Dan,
and that's a cultural decision.
Right. Dan, I've got to ask, did you have a Nokia phone?
I did have a Nokia phone, yes.
Didn't we all have a Nokia phone? I'm sure I had a Nokia 8310. James, did you have a Nokia phone? He's giving me a thumbs up. We're all probably of a certain age where we remember Nokia. Do you remember the Nokias? They were great. They were indestructible, weren't they, Dan? I think it was.
They would break the floor when you dropped them.
But they were good at what they were good at. They made calls and they received calls. But I digress. I'm interested, let me ask you and forgive this is a too simplistic a question, but I get asked this by leaders a lot. What is culture? So many different definitions, but where have you landed in relation to the answer to that question? What is culture, Dan?
Yeah, it's a hard question for some people to answer, and I think academics struggle with this. There's nearly 100 really, really strong academic definitions.
Luckily, I'm not
there.
an academic, so that will be that's a step forward.
I mean, for me, I always looked at the root of the word culture, which was actually from Latin and from the word cultus, which means to care about people, to care about what you're doing and how you're doing it. So to me, I define culture as the way we do things around here when no one is looking. And that's a very important part that I add to the end of the sentence, when no one is looking, because I believe that you cannot trick culture. You cannot force culture upon people. You have to do it because you believe in it and you think it's the right thing to do, not because you want to look good and you want to have nice, values stuck on the wall as a sticker. So it's the way we do things around here when no one is looking and there's no advantage to be gained.
Now, there's a lot in your book, empowering your people to drive innovation. And I want to pick up on a couple of things, if I may, Dan, because those are incredibly important at the moment. And I have a bias, I've got to admit to that. And as you know, much of my focus is on human-centered leadership. So I want to focus on your focus about putting people first. Tell me a little bit about what you mean by putting people first and why is that so important?
Yeah, I think that a company is typically made up of 4 main stakeholder groups.
Okay.
So you have your people, you have your employees, the people that work there, either full-time, part-time, as a gig work, whatever that might be. They're interested people in the company and they're your employees.
Yep.
You also have your customers, logically.
Yep.
So the people that buy or consume your products or services. The third stakeholder group would be your shareholders or financial stakeholders, so the ones who have a financial interest in the performance of the company.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fourth is your communities, so the communities that you operate in, the locations where you work in, and so on and so forth. And I like to look at those 4 stakeholders as a virtuous circle.
Okay.
So if you improve one of those groups, you improve all 3 of the others by default. So if you have happier employees,
yes,
as an example, you probably have more engaged customers, which gives you more profitability, which means you can invest more in your communities. And you can start anywhere on that virtuous circle, but you'll help improve all of them. And why I say put employees first, well, this is because they are the lifeblood of your company. They are the people who have the ideas that deliver the products and services that are there day in, day out. And they are really interested in making the company successful. And, one great example that I always like to use is Southwest Airlines. You probably know Southwest changed the industry. They turned around their planes within 10 minutes from landing to take off again.
Yeah.
And if you ask me, there's no worse job in the world than picking up people's luggage, taking it on and off the plane, and then being told you have to do that within 10 minutes. To me, it sounds like back-breaking work. But Southwest made it a success because they put fun into the workplace and they put their people first. They explained that the people who take the luggage on and off the plane, that clean the toilets, get the seats ready for the next set of customers, are the lifeblood of the company, the ones that make us successful. We're working towards a purpose and a vision. And to me, it's just a wonderful example of when you treat your people first and in a really good way with a compelling vision, give them great benefits, they will work really hard for you. And you can't compete with people who love what they're doing.
There's a huge benefit, isn't there, to really valuing every single person who works for the organisation. It reminds me of that story. You'll have to help me with this. Wasn't it the janitor at NASA? Wasn't it one of the presidents once spoke to him and said, "What do you do here?" And he actually said, "I help put a man on the moon." And actually, even in his role, he felt he was part and parcel of everyone contributing to that vision, that outcome.
Exactly. That's the really famous story. And I think we all have to learn from that. We're all working towards a purpose. And when you really do love what you're doing and you can see that, you're going to do a great job.
You're the second person who's mentioned Southwest Airlines, Southwestern, isn't it, Airlines to me today, which is bizarre, isn't it? It happens like that. Someone else was saying that they've got an extraordinary interview process that actually they bring you to the office, and then what they actually do is they check with every single person you've interacted with, whether it was getting on the plane or the baggage staff or the receptionist or the person who's driving the coach or the car. And actually, if you've been in some ways rude or disrespectful to any one of those people, you don't even make it to the interview. I think that's a fascinating story in itself, which I think I'm set to explore later on in the year with someone. So it is funny that two people have just mentioned that. Let me move, if I can, to asking you a little bit more about this virtuous circle. So I've got employees, customers, your shareholders, or those with financial stakeholding, and the communities. Let me focus on communities for a minute, because a number of people have picked up on the phrase being a force for good. The larger the organisation, perhaps the more impetus on that organisation to add value to the communities within which they operate, beyond maybe the product or service that they're known for. So how are they actually adding to the communities within which they operate? Perhaps those communities are not even their customer or their client. Any thoughts on this inertia for being a force for good, that actually large organisations are actually more powerful than governments in relation to the people that they reach and the impact that they have? Any thoughts on that, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, it's the right thing to do, so you should be doing it. And from a cultural perspective, it sets a very good tone for your business. So, of course, if you encourage investment in your communities and you help your communities, even if they're not your customers, it's true there's an underlying business benefit there, which means maybe the brand of your company becomes known, maybe you convert some people into customers, and so on and so forth. Maybe people look at your endeavors and say, I would like to work there. It looks like they care and they have a good culture. So there's a positive from a business place and a business decision, but it's about doing the right thing. And if you look at the COVID response around the world, if I take the financial services industry, many large financial services players set up immediate funding for COVID, people impacted by COVID, be that companies or individuals that were not necessarily customers of those financial services institutions. They also had very strong logistics by the nature of the work that they do. So the logistics and supply chains of some of the large corporates are wonderful, better than some of the governments, you could say. And they actually helped bring PPE to the frontline workers faster than the countries were doing themselves and the governments could do themselves. So it's those kind of instances where you say, okay, I'm a massive conglomerate. Can I get PPE to the front line faster? Should I do that? Yes, you should. You should absolutely do that. That's your social responsibility. That's about being a good citizen for the world. And this is important, of course, culturally, because it makes people proud to work in that company. It makes the community happy to have that company located in wherever that location is. But we have to be thinking in that way. Gone are the days of excessive profits and only caring about business results. people want to work and partner with companies that have a purpose.
The reality of COVID, isn't it, Dan, that actually we had organisations that some ended up as saints and some ended up as sinners. Do you think COVID actually broke the back of some organisations' culture, that they just got it wrong and there's almost no coming back from it?
Yeah, I think COVID did that in people's personal lives and also in the professional lives and the lives of companies. And, in a way, that's a good thing because it means we accelerated that pace of change and the tree was shaken and the best ones stay and the worst ones fall away. But absolutely, this was something that people were watching, people were very conscious of. And I think the ones that really did a great effort won't be forgotten. And I know, being in Madrid, we have the white taxis, so not the black cabs of London, but there's the white taxis that go around.
Right.
And they were taking people to and from the hospitals every day during COVID, free of charge, as their sense of service to the community.
Wow.
And I think when you look at the implications of having Uber and Lyft and all these ride-sharing apps, and you look at the market penetrations in Madrid, for example, and you see that the white cabs are being very resilient and in the face of that, I suspect it's not only because of their skills in navigating the streets and the knowledge that they have, but it's also because people want to respect them and pay them back for the service that they chose to do.
Now, Dan, let me ask you this question. How important is this subject, is culture, to the younger generation, the incredible talent coming in and coming through organisations? Just how important is it to them?
I think it's critical to them. I have a mentor who told me a story once that he called the millennial interview.
Right.
And actually, I write it up at length in the book because it's a wonderful story.
Okay.
But basically,
I like a story.
Millennial comes into an interview, sits down the other side of the desk from the interviewer, and the interviewer says, okay, I'm going to ask some questions. And they go through the formal interview, as it were. And then the millennial says, okay, it's my turn to ask the questions about you. And the interviewer is a little bit taken back and says, well, right. Okay, if you must. And the first question the millennial says is, okay, tell me about your maternity policy. And the interviewer smiles and says, oh, I know the answer to this. Reaches into the desk drawer, pulls out an A4 binder full of paper, flicks to page 200 and starts reading the policy line by line. And the millennial says, well, you didn't do so well on that. Tell me about something else. And again, the interviewer goes to page 600, finds the answer and says, here's the answer. And the millennial says, okay, fine. Thanks for that. Thanks for the interview. I've interviewed you and I'm going to post my review of the company on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on all the social medias. And that's interesting because we are now having people judge companies in a very public and visible way. So there's Glassdoor, there's all these kind of ranking websites, and people care who is the CEO, what kind of leadership skills do they use and deploy in the day-to-day, and what is the operating culture of the company? And people value that. And it's not only millennials, but they're the ones that have really pushed this to the forefront. But it's everyone.
Dan, has the power shifted?
The power is shifting. I think it really, really depends because much is dependent on the economy. If you would have asked me that question 6 months ago, we would have said absolutely yes. Right. The employee can choose the company 100%. And now, as we mentioned at the start, with the recent layoffs in tech, perhaps the market is cooling down and that means employees are less powerful. That said, never have the employees been more powerful than today. And people are not choosing to work in places for financial reasons only. And that's a very important change because, our parents chose to work in stable financial institutions or stable institutions for financial reasons.
Right.
And now people are choosing because, yes, I want to be paid for what I do fairly, but I also want to work on something important. I want to have a purpose. I want to have a balance with my work and life. I want to have access to the best technology and the brightest minds and so on and so forth. So the shift is there.
And that really resonates because, as one guest said to me, that meaning is the new money. And I think we're certainly seeing evidence of that, aren't we, Dan? Let me move on to the second element. And again, I'm only touching on two elements. So please, if anyone wants to know more, The Culture Advantage is Dan's book. And I'll ask Dan how you can get in touch with him as well in a moment. But I want to talk about the leader's role in all this and how absolutely essential it is for leaders to really own and participate in shaping and living the culture. Tell me a little bit about your research and findings in relation to that, the leader's role in this.
Yeah, so this is really, really critical. Of course, culture is everybody's job and everyone has to contribute to it. But the leaders have an outsized role to play. And this became very, very clear in my research. And by the way, for the book, I went from Asia to North America to South America through Europe, looking at companies, what they've done right and what they've not done right. And it was very clear that as a leader, you are responsible for driving the culture and leading the culture. And the people that outsource the culture to human resources, to communications, to marketing, whoever that might be, don't yet understand the value of culture, and their cultural transformations have been doomed to failure by making that decision. So leaders, you have an outsized role to play, and you have to be a visible role model every day for the culture. As a leader, most people are paying attention to the actions you take and can see, but they're also paying attention to the ones that you don't take. So sometimes I saw companies where toxic behaviors were happening in the workplace and the leadership were not doing anything about it.
Right,
well,
tolerating
people know
it.
that. People can see that. And you need to take actions all the time. And what you don't do also speaks volumes. So I think that's really, really important.
And it's, you talk about the visibility of a leader, and I'm glad you've said what you've said, because leaders are on show all the time, whether you're having a bad day or not. And what is the shadow that they're casting within the organisation? I know that's something that we look at for organisations all the time, and that aspect of, what am I saying, what am I doing, what am I measuring, what am I prioritising, and am I being congruent? And many listeners will recognise that as the leader's shadow, or certainly the kind of work that many consultancies do on culture. Tell me a little bit more, though, about the need for culture to be really part and parcel of the DNA, because you said actually it's everyone's role. So I'm thinking from the CEO to the newest intern and everything in between. How does a leader start to really get that lived by everyone within an organisation, which is sometimes an incredibly large organisation, and as you just said, across regions? So there are cultural nuances as well, because we could have teams working in Singapore, in Dubai, in North America, Australia, so on and so forth. So how?
Yeah, definitely. There's many tactics and many things you can deploy, but I think the most important one is to be visible and lead by example. So when I think about lead by example, I always think of the first woman in space in 1983 in the United States.
Right.
A lady called Sally Ride. And she was a wonderful astronaut. And she went to space in 83. And when she came back, she spent the rest of her career really focused on education and teaching people. And she realized that you can't be what you can't see. And her realization was that her new job was to be the visible woman. And she wasn't happy with that at the start. This wasn't natural to her. She didn't want to do it, but she knew it was her responsibility to be visible, to give other girls the hope and the chance and the expectation to succeed in whatever career that might be, including astronauts. And that really resonated with me when I was going deep into her research. And there's a fantastic Harvard Business Review case study on her and an interview with her before she passed away.
Right. And
she really made an effort on this. And I think it had lasting impacts. And in a more modern day sense, of course, we all know Jeff Bezos of Amazon.
We do.
Well, he wanted frugality to be the culture of Amazon. And he set that frugality from day one, because in 1995, he was looking for a new desk. And he went to the local hardware store to buy a desk. And he said, wow, these desks are expensive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy a door and attach 4 legs to it and use that as my desk, because I'm being frugal and I'm caring about the customer. So he did this visible reminder that frugality was our value, our culture, or part of it. And today, in Amazon offices around the world, you see doors as desks.
In 2022.
in 2022. I don't know if the health and safety people have anything to say about that, but there we are.
Yeah, I mean, that story has changed slightly since 1995. Hasn't it, Dan, to be fair? I wanted to share that quote. I'm also, from the conversations we've had previously, there's that wonderful quote from the Dutch fellow. And if you could just give us that quote, because I think it's quite lovely.
Yeah, I would butcher his name, Alexander Den Haya, I think. But he's an expert on leadership and transformation and purpose within companies. And he says, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower.
Yeah.
And that's really important because that's the role of a leader. The role of a leader is to fix the environment, to create an environment where people can bloom and grow. It's not about looking the best, having the best results and suppressing your team. It's about helping them grow and do the best work that they can do. So I love that quote, absolutely.
No, me too, which is why I'm very glad that you just referenced that at the end of this episode. Dan, how can people, this is an obvious question, I think you probably already mentioned it in one of your previous answers, how can people get hold of the book?
Well, you can go on Amazon or any good bookstore. And actually, I'll make a special offer to anyone listening, which is if you buy the book and you don't enjoy it, I will give you a no questions full refund on the spot. You just have to email me and I'll do it.
There you go.
Because I'm really convinced that the people listening to the Leadership Enigma will love it.
There you go, a money back guarantee. We do love that. Dan, how do people get in touch with you to continue the conversation or get you involved in theirs?
I'm on danielstrode.com, but also LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn. That would be one of the best platforms for contacting me there. Dan Strode.
Brilliant. And my last question to you, Dan, and this might be an unfair question. I haven't asked this question for a while, actually. I don't know why. But with all of the research and all of the work you've done, all the experiences that you have, what would be the top leadership tip that comes to mind for you that you've ever received or given?
It's a really good question. And it's true. I haven't heard it on the previous podcasts for a while. But it's one of your friends, actually, Gary Ridge from the WD-40 company. Yeah. He, he's been on the podcast and he actually helped me with the book. He passed me a lot of wisdom. I've got a case study in there about WD-40 and just a wonderful company and wonderful person. But he told me that the role of a leader is to serve the team, is not to serve themselves. And when I really started to understand that a role of a leader is to serve the team, make a workplace where people want to come and contribute and participate, something in me changed. It really stuck with me. And it said, we have to be less self-interested and more interested in the team. And I think that is, if you do that, you're going to be a great leader. No,
good advice. And I'm glad you've referenced that particular episode. And if you're listening to this, then you can just go back a few episodes and Gary Ridge, and that was the tribe of WD-40, because he was an amazing example, wasn't he, of a CEO who had maniacal focus on culture. And I know that Gary's just stepped down as the CEO and chairman after 26 years. And he had a big impact on me, Dan, as well, when I chatted to him, because it takes that kind of focus and relentless relentless work on culture from the top, doesn't it, to be successful in this?
Definitely. And actually, it was really interesting doing the book and going through the research phase.
Right.
When I spoke to leaders who understood culture, developed it and focused on it, I would come away knowing that their company would be successful. And for the rest of the week, I was much happier and much more engaged with my work. And then when I was researching companies who were not perhaps in that line, and I was having stock answers and, answers from the manual, basically.
Page 213.
I was, a bit worried, I was a bit concerned and, a bit more flat for the rest of the week. So Gary was one that gave me a lot of his time. And it's because he did a really, really good cultural transformation in the WD-40 company. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, culture is so important. We can't really talk about it enough. So, Dan, I'm really grateful to you for coming on to the Leadership Enigma. I hope you've had fun. I know you're in Spain. I think I'd rather be in Spain right now. Although, to be fair, the weather... Oh, I'm moaning about the weather. That's such a London thing, isn't it? Next time, hopefully, you'll come and see us in the studio and we'll have another conversation about culture.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Adam.
Dan, thanks for being an absolute superstar. Take care. We'll see you soon.